Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to focus on Greek burial practices and the concept of the afterlife and death, because we emphasize it so much with the Egyptians. I wanted to make sure we kind of got a little contrast, but also we have two images in the image set that are related to burial practices. So I kind of skipped through this. I decided to kind of save a little bit of time because of yesterday. And so I had a reading through Wikipedia, which was actually a pretty decent one, on Greek death and burial rituals. And so what we're going to focus on is these special burials and beliefs in the afterlife. Okay, so this is context for number 27 and 36 in your note takers. I don't think you have to write all of this verbatim, but I will emphasize for you some of the major concepts. So the Greeks used to, like during the time of the Mycenaean, which is during the Aegean period. Sorry, that screen is like wavy. That's strange, isn't it? You guys are seeing that, right? Not just me. I'm not sure what's going on. So they used to do kind of mass graves. So the Mycenaean had these honeycomb tombs, or they'd have these pit tombs, and they would bury multiple people in a group tomb. So the Greeks, after 1100 BCE, started to bury their dead into individual graves instead. And so the Athenians, right, there are a bunch of city-states in Greece. The Athenians would often cremate the body and place them in urns instead of just burying the body. And during the time of Pericles, with the rise of democracy, he's the one who rebuilt the Acropolis. We see the burials actually not being overly complicated. There are specific rituals that people did. And so things like the Anavysos Kouros are very typical of like grave markers. So the one on the left is the kind of grave marker you would place on top of an individual tomb. But after the 4th century, with the decline of democracy, the aristocrats would make much more elaborate tombs. And the stele of Hegeso on the right side is an example of that more elaborate burial. And often what they would do is they would show off their wealth. And so when we talk about this image, we'll talk about how it shows off the wealth of her family. Right? So they had very specific death rituals. If you knew you were dying, like let's say you had illness or you had been wounded, your family would come to your bedside to kind of say goodbye to you. And women had a major role in the funeral rites. So they would anoint the body, they would wrap it up in fabric. Women would be mourning, and I have some imagery to kind of show this to you. Women would be a big part of the mourning procedures. And so the wife or the mother was kind of like the chief mourner. And so whatever she would do, everyone would kind of copy. And the ultra rich would actually hire mourners. And so the more people you had crying over your dead body, the better. It was like showed off your status. And the reason that they went to such elaborate measures is that the Egyptians, it's like, great, I'm moving on to the afterlife, no big deal. My life kind of continues. But the Greeks saw death as a horrible thing. They saw it as, it was like life was in black and white. You were kind of stuck in this kind of like, other world, and it was not a place that you wanted to go, right? So they had a series of funerary rites called Protheses that they kind of, had very extensive rituals for. So they would give offerings, they would give libations, so like wine or other beverages, they would donate, they would pour over the grave. Sometimes there was even blood offerings. The entire household was cleansed after the burial because the dead were seen as dirty. And so a lot of these tombs and a lot of these cemeteries and necropolises gates of the city. They were far away. The Romans did that too. They kind of kept death away because, death is sometimes contagious, especially if someone is like dead from like major illness, like contagious illnesses, but also, decay and smell and that sort of thing. They normally kept that away from the life of the living. And so they would also, kind of clean the household, but they'd also have very elaborate feasts where the family would get together to mourn the deceased. And so that's sort of similar to what we saw with the Egyptians, right? So sort of honoring your loved ones as they move into as they pass into the other world.
Let me just get rid of this so it stops dinging.
Okay, so when we're looking at ancient Greece, we're really focused on the area that we see here kind of in pink. But the video did elaborate about how the Greek sort of empire did reach all the way to India with Alexander the Great. But we're mostly talking about the mainland and then the series of islands that we see here. So the first period of art in Greece is what we call the geometric period. And we don't have any images in the image set, but this is really common when you take a college level art history class to be able to see their pottery. Their best preserved images are in pottery. And how are they geometric? What elements of them are geometric? Why do you think they call it geometric style? Look at the figure. What shape is the body? It's like a triangle shape, right? And there's often like geometric patterns in like different elements of it. So in the neck of the piece, you can see that there's a series of squares. So there is very little, it's not very realistic in its detail. We'll see much more elaborate pottery when we get to classical period. This is a crater, and what is it used for, right? Our theme is death and ritual, right? This is a great example of the pouring of libations, okay? The very first grave markers that we have during this time period is that they would take one of these giant craters and place it on top of the burial, okay? There's no base to this pot. So if I pour wine or beer or anything else into this pot, it's going to run over the grave, right? And this is called the diapon vase. We have many different examples of pottery in Greek and Roman art history, and they all have different purposes. This one is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's probably the best known one. It's called the diapon vase. It's at the gates of the city, and that's where the cemetery was in Athens. So this is from Athens. You can see that it's not really small and it's not functional because you look at the size, it was really big. So this was a grave marker. So this is the first type of grave marker. And the nice thing about this one, it has such great details that teach us about the death rituals, right? Why do we know all these things? They had, ceremonies, horses. Look at the realism there with that horse, right? Isn't that hilarious? This is stacked horses in front of each other. That's why it has 3 heads and all those legs, right? There might be soldiers. This kind of looks Aegean, but the Aegeans had these really strange shields that we didn't get to see. I did add that presentation for you in the agenda yesterday, if you're really interested in looking at it. But this is the best part, right? This is the part that really talks to us about Protheus, right? What are they doing in the sea? What are they doing? What is this stuff right here? Really loud next door. What are they doing here? Yeah. Right? Basically, what is happening here is the body, this is probably after anointing, but that's okay. This is probably the body lying in state. So the body would lie in state where the family could come and pay homage to them. And so standing nearby, this is probably the chief wife, and this is her mourners. How do I know these people are mourning? What's the visual clue? Right? These women would dress in black, and they would pull their hair, and they would scream and cry. And so when you look at the heads, there are circles, and they have giant black circles on their mouth. That's them wailing. And then their hands are up at their head, pulling out their hair because they're so upset that this person has died. Right? So this really does explain a lot about their death ritual. You can see other family members sitting around the body. So, you know, that kind of deals with the idea of basic concept of death. You kind of move, your soul kind of moved into the afterlife, into this dark place. So Archaic period is our next period. And one of the things that we'll be encountering now is the nude figure, right? We're going to be encountering the nude figure. So it's always good for me to kind of start. Smart History has edited this article. And so I'm not going to go ahead and show it. But one of the things that we will see a lot is, what is the difference between naked and nude, right? If I said the figure was nude, what does that imply in art? And what does naked imply, right, in art or in life? Does anyone have any idea what the major difference is? Yeah. Right. Right. So nude is, it is supposed to be presented the human form, right? And so they're showing it in kind of its bareness, right? But naked implies some shame, right? It implies some shame. So in Christian art, we'll see images of Adam and Eve more naked because they're covering themselves, right? They're ashamed of something. But we're going to see a lot of bodies of nude figures, especially in ancient Greece. When we look at Hindu art, it is not something that is shameful. It is not something that is erotic. It is not something that is pornographic. It is something that is just considered, this is what the human body looks like, right? And so we have a lot of these Kouros figures. So they mentioned it in the video. This is one at the Met. And this is actually called the Met Kerose. It got its name from where it lives. But during the Archaic period, they would take these male figures and they placed them on graves. So these are grave markers once again. So we used to have vases, and then we got sculptures. And why is he nude? Right? Why is he nude? The Greeks believed that the ideal form was a male form around 18 years old. Have we heard that before? What other culture had like an ideal form that was youthful? The ancient Egypt. So the Greeks just took it from the ancient Egyptians. It's not something that they came up all on their own. They knew about ancient Egypt, obviously through location and trade. And so they copied and mimicked the style. We see pleated hair from the Near East, right? They mentioned in the video that added extra structure to the neck so the heads wouldn't break off, right? They're stiff, they're formal, they have one leg forward, right? But their proportions weren't perfect yet. So in this early example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 7 heads tall. His head's a little big for his body, okay? And so we have that Greek influence, we have that early influences of things like pleated hair and that formal quality that we saw with the Egyptians, right? As well as ideal body, youthful ideal body, okay? So that leads us to the Anavysos Kouros. So what is it for, right? What is the function and who is depicted, right? Our theme is death and burial. So what do you think the function of it is? It's a grave marker. So this is a funerary grave marker. And who is depicted? This is a ideal male youth from an aristocratic family, right? He was a soldier. There was an inscription found by this sculpture. We think it is for this one. We're not entirely sure, okay? And so that's why he has this name, is that the inscription says that this is Anavysos, right? And he was a soldier. He died in battle. Okay, so that's what the inscription tells us. Right? So you're looking at content, right? We have our nude figure, right? We have our new male figure. Think about his age, right? Think about his age. If he died at, let's say, 40, it looks like he's a general. Does he look like he's 40? No, they would always depict the figure youthful during the archaic and geometric, or the archaic period, even sometimes in the classical period as well. Sometimes we start to see a little bit more age in the face, but generally they showed them very youthful, okay? And why is he portrayed this way, right? Why would they portray him this way? They portrayed him this way to explain his perfection. And the best way to honor someone who was killed in battle, right, would be, because that would be like the preferred way of going, right, is that you were defending your city-state, right, is that you would be shown in a heroic way. So showing him youthful, showing him muscular, showing him cool, calm, and collected is the best way to portray him. It's dignified, okay, according to the ancient Greeks. Does that make sense? I wish I could soundproof that wall. Right? So let's compare the proportions. How is he more proportional compared to the neck Kouros? Yeah. His shoulders and hips are wider. Yeah. His neck is shorter and wider, and he has better proportions. So he is more true to life size. So this sculpture is pretty much life size. I think it's slightly smaller. I have seen it. It's like slightly smaller. This one is in the Athens Museum at the Acropolis. So at the foot of the Acropolis, they built this beautiful museum that's half empty, and we'll talk about that later. And this is standing there, right? And so he's much more, oh, something's up. The Greeks were really obsessed with order, and they used mathematical proportions in measuring and coming up with the proportions of the body. We'll see them using this in architecture. They had rules. A building had to have these parts and these proportions, and you followed like a recipe, right? They were very, very strict about it. The Romans, they would just do whatever they wanted and take their favorites from the Greeks, but the Greeks had a formula. And the Greeks believed that proportion favored goodness, right? It had a sense of balance, it had a sense of harmony, it would exude the goodness of the person represented or the structure that it was in. So not only is it like, 7.5 heads tall, but also, they would kind of like figure out and compare parts and make sure that that was very proportional as well. Okay, so what styles did we reference? We already talked about this. If you were going to talk about compare contrast, right? What are the things that you can say that are the same? What's the same? Here. Right. So the young body, youthful body, muscular, anything else? Sadie? Exactly. So we got one foot in front of the other, right? So it means that they're striding forward. There's a sense of movement there, even though it's very stiff. Can you see that? It's kind of like the lamassu, right? Remember the lamassu for the front is stoic, but from the side, you got one foot in front. What's the difference in the stance? What's the difference? have negative space here. They cut out the space. The Egyptians kept some of that stone in between the legs for structure, but the Greeks had enough confidence in their ability that they got rid of the space in between the legs. So this is a fully functioning sculpture. It is seen in the round. You can see the back side of it, which I don't think I have. Oh, I do have the back side of it. There he is, right? So he is fully shown in the round, okay? He is in form, he is what we call, he's from the Archaic period, but he's also something we call archaic. And so when we look at it, what is the Archaic style? The Archaic style is stiff and formal, right? Formal is like calm, cool, collected, kind of rigid in stance. He has an archaic smile. An archaic smile is like this little hint of life that the Greeks like to use. And so some of them, their smiles are really over the top. They have pleated hair, right? So stylized hair. And he once was painted. So he would have been painted. There are traces of color still in his hair. Right? So the archaic smile indicates life. This one, you can see how the smile is much more pronounced. This one has lost his legs under his knees, but you can see that this is very standard. This is a different figure, but looks the same, right? So there's many, many examples of these in the cemeteries for these different men who died in battle, were athletes, very, very common. So Kouros were grave markers. Right? So as we move into a classical period, we will talk more about classical time period when we talk about architecture, but we will see that we'll get into the style later. So I will allude to it for our image, but then we'll kind of move on. When we talk about classical arts, there's a lot of lots of things that come to my mind, right? So when we talk about classical art, we're going to be talking about Greek and Roman art, okay? We'll mostly talk about ancient Greek and Roman, right? Classical art equals the height of Greek culture and art. This is the pinnacle. This is the time of Pericles. This is the time of Kallimachos. This is the time of the Parthenon. These are the things that we call like the ideals of Greek art, okay? We also sometimes call art classical if it's been inspired by the ancient Greek and Roman artists and architects. So things like the Renaissance, we call classical because it is a revival of the classics, okay? But then we also have a time period we'll talk about that's called neoclassical, right? And the neoclassical happens kind of at the birth of our nation. Think about all the images and all, like go to Washington, D.C., and you see classical building, classical building, classical building, and you see images of George Washington, and he is very classical inspired, right? And so these are also things that we call classical. But in our terms of when we're going to be talking about art history, when I talk about classical art, we're going to think about the ancient, right? But we will also talk about how these Renaissance artists are inspired by the ancient and how these neoclassical artists were inspired by the classics as well, right? So let's stand up for a second. Stand up. Let's go ahead and let's do this first. Step forward like he is. So that is his left leg. So stand with your left leg forward, arms on your side. Aren't we comfy? You guys comfy? No. Okay, so then shake it loose. Shake it loose. And then just stand. So how do you stand normally? How do you stand normally? I have really good posture. I do. Let's see. You guys have good posture. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So the reason for that is this is the next, you guys have a seat. This is the next variation of Kouros figure. So during the early classical period, instead of having these stiff Kouros figures, they gave us what we call contraposto. So contraposto is a counterbalance. So what happens is your weight I'm gonna do it right now. I'm shifting my weight to my right leg. And what that does is it pops my left hip up and then my shoulders tilt. And so it feels more lifelike. So you don't need the archaic smile to make something look real anymore. We can have more realistic body positions, right? So contraposto, we will talk about this when we look at Kallimachos as well. That is the Dorpheus figure that we have in our image set. So contraposto, it's the Italian word for counterpose, contrapose, right? So besides the fact that I have like weight shifted, basically what happens is we have this leg that's like got all the weight. We call that the engaged leg. And then the other one is like relaxed. And then often they would use arms. Now, of course, he's missing his arms, but usually it's like the opposite. So like if this is the engaged leg, my left would be engaged and my right would be relaxed. So it's like opposites on diagonals, right? But also when I run, okay, I don't run anymore, but when I run, that's how we look, right? We have that opposite counterbalance, right? So here's a fun part too. Look at you went to Greece. Much more lifelike, right? So this is called the Christos boy. So his body is, still idealized, and he's got that counterweight. He too was a grade marker. So you can see, you can see kind of the variation, right? So during the high classical period, we can start to see that the grave markers that were sculptures become steles. What is stele again? What is stele? We had it at Hammurabi's. We had it in our anthropomorphic with a stele. Yeah. Right. It's basically a tombstone. It is a marker of something of importance. So usually it's some sort of important battle. It would have some sort of text on it. And so it basically is like what we consider to be a gravestone now, right? And so we see that during the classic period. One of the things, this is not in our image set, but here we can actually see the contemplation of death, right? And talking about the Greek kind of belief in death. And so you see that the body is much more proportional, but don't you also see, even though this is not exactly contraposto, but can you see it's more realistic in body positioning, right? So it's not stiff, it's not formal, much more realistic, right? Still youthful though, but he's got all this worry and angst in his eyes. So we'll see that as we move into classical, late classical, right? So that leads us to our great stele of Pegasus. Pegasus, right? And we actually think we know the artist name. So Kallimachos, right? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so I apologize. The function is in the name, right? The function is in the name. So this is a grave marker, a grave stele. And so how has the burial tradition changed from the archaic, right? How has it changed from the archaic? What's different? I think I already said this just a few minutes ago. Is this a sculpture anymore? No, this is a relief, right? So it's a stele and it's a relief, right? So it's a stele rather than figurative sculpture. And in relief means that it has a flat wall and it comes from the material in which it's on and it becomes three-dimensional. So how is she portrayed on this? So we see a woman here. So we haven't seen a woman, right? So now we see a woman. How is she portrayed? Go ahead and chat with the people sitting next to you. How is she portrayed? What is she doing? Any idea what she's doing? What does she look like she's doing? How is she portrayed? Who can help me out? How is she portrayed? For discussion. Go ahead, thank you. So we have a seated female figure. So we have a seated female figure, and then we have another woman standing near her. And I like the point that you said that she's fully clothed, right? Women were not shown nude until much later, right? The ideal form in ancient Greek was the male nude, not the female nude. We don't see that until the late classical, and the female nude always had a function. She was bathing, and that's why she was nude, right? It had nothing to do with showing the ideal form. It had to have a function to it, right? So she is an upper class woman. Remember how in the beginning of this discussion, we said that after the decline of democracy in the later period, we started to have more elaborate burials and the showing off of individual families' wealth. And so this scene does that. So we have this upper class woman who's seated on a chair. Her feet are kind of raised up on some sort of box. So she's got her feet on top of something. And she is actually contemplating what jewelry she should put on. So that's not an offering, that shows her wealth. So she has a servant, this is her servant, bringing her her jewelry box, helping her decide what she's going to put on for the day. So women of ancient Greek did not have a lot of social status. They lived pretty much in the home. Their entire lives kind of revolved around that. Occasionally they might get out to go shopping or go gather water or something like that, but they were pretty secluded. And so here she is, secluded, picking up her jewelry. But it shows her family status. Right? And then how is it high classical? Now, we will talk about classical art later, but it's probably important to make sure we get it into these notes too, even though we're focusing on death and burial, is that this is high classical. So actually, this is the time of democracy, but it does show the wealth. She's shown more proportional. So it's more mathematically balanced, smaller head, proportional to the body. She's shown idealized, so she's shown beautiful. And then what we see in the classical period, especially the figures like the ones on the Acropolis, like the Parthenon, is that even though the female figure is not shown nude, they often are, you can see their body pressing through fabric. And so one of the things they often did is made the fabric look like it was wet. So like she's caught in the rain, so you can see her breasts coming through, you can see her legs coming through the fabric. It's almost like the fabric is stuck to her to show off her form rather than showing the nude form. And that's pretty typical of goddess imagery, of average people imagery of the high classes. So we already talked about this because you guys brought it up. So you can see how the male and the female figure were portrayed differently. Okay, we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to kind of review a few things before we leave. So what are the techniques that make sculptures look lifelike? What's the thing that makes him look lifelike on the left? What does he have? The archaic smile. So that's an important vocabulary term to know, archaic smile. And then what does our Christos boy have? Contraposto, right? So archaic smile, contraposto. This does not have contraposto, right? Contraposto has engaged leg, engaged arm, relaxed leg, relaxed arm, and you have that shifting. So notice how the hips are tilted, the knees are tilted, and the shoulders are not so tilted here, but they will become more tilted. Okay. You know what, we'll just start with this tomorrow. We got through farther than I would if we did it on a Wednesday, which is fine. So we'll start with looking at some female figures, our core sculptures tomorrow.